Thank you so much for that generous introduction. I am going to tell you a little bit about my story and ultimately the story that came to the founding of Mobilize. But I'd like to begin by turning and thanking the amazing staff and the folks who helped put this event on. It was to think about 10 years ago that we would be in events such as this with amazing talent in the room, such as all of you, and to have a staff like the staff that has come together is truly unbelievable. And there was one person in particular who we'd like to thank who really made all of this possible. I know there was I was actually in the elevator today and somebody turned and said, "So I hear we're all here because of you." And I was like, what's this from? And I know that it was from Maya's introduction, but really, you know, we are all here because of the tireless effort of an entire staff, but specifically one particular director who organized all of the logistics to help make sure everybody could get here, and is the person who I know many of you guys have been in touch with via email, and it is amazing to have her on the team and to see these events just come through every single time, getting better and better and better. So I'd like to present some flowers to Amber.
I wasn't going to cry, but this is probably going to happen several times today.
So now I guess to my story, which is I guess is becoming more and more all of our stories. And it's funny, I actually was sharing it, starting to share a little bit yesterday, and as I started at my table, one of the members of the table turned and goes, "Oh, I've read this," because I guess the story has been now retold many different times and ultimately has made its way into a lot of the Mobilize materials. But my story began back in 2002 as I was an undergraduate at the University of California. And so it's great to be back in the Bay Area and to come back from DC and see all of you and the beautiful weather and get to drive around the Bay Area. Personally, San Francisco has a special place in my heart as I'm actually sixth generation San Franciscan. So my story begins as an undergraduate who basically was confronted with a few issues in my life that required me to wake up and to act. The first was as a freshman, I had housing on campus, and then after my freshman year, they ended up kicking out all of the freshmen because there wasn't enough dorm space for everyone to stay. So I ended up having to move all the way up into Richmond and commute 45 minutes each day in the terrible Bay Area traffic. Commuting each day and then trying to find a parking spot around Berkeley, and ultimately it was not really a lifestyle that I felt that I had signed up for. In addition to that, I was working 3 jobs to afford at that time what I considered one of the best cost options, which was going to one of the best public universities in the country. But I was working 2 jobs initially and then 3 jobs, and then all of a sudden I found out that they were about to raise student fees again, which I know is not an uncommon thing here in California, and you guys have probably encountered several times already just in the past few years. At that time, they were about to raise student fees by $93 million across the entire state. What that meant was for almost each individual student, it was a matter of a few hundred to a few $1,000s over the course of a year. And I was already pretty stretched trying to afford my housing that was not anywhere close to campus, and ultimately still try to go to school. And so I was faced with the decision of, do I drop out of school so that I can go and take another job so I can make enough money to be able to come back in, or do I stand up and say something about it? And so I got together with a couple of my friends, one of which was actually a permanent couch surfer. He actually couldn't even afford to live 45 minutes away from campus, so he was jumping from couch to couch around the Berkeley neighborhoods. And luckily he had enough friends that he could do that. But ultimately, we got together with one other guy and we said, this isn't really what we signed up for. When we thought that we were going to the best public university in the nation, and ultimately, of course, the best university in the Bay Area, if not the world. What we were signing up for was not one that, was not this lifestyle, and we thought that there was a promise that was made to us that was something that we wanted to see fulfilled. So we decided to say, well, what can we do about it? So we went up to one of our state assembly members and we said, what can we do about this? We hear that you're about to raise student fees significantly. There's no affordable housing anywhere near campus, and the UC budgets are getting slashed in a similar way that they're slashing them right now. And they said, well, you need to show up. And she was very honest with us, and she turned to us and she said, well, you guys are, you're the young person demographic. You guys are 18 to 25 years old. In 2002, you guys showed up at the ballot box at less than 20%, which means when I see 5 of you coming into my office, I look at that as one vote. When I see somebody who's 65 years old or 70 years old coming to my office, I look at that person as one vote, because ultimately they show up. And that's the reason why when we end up balancing our budgets, often they get balanced on the backs of students. So we said, okay, show up. We'll do that. Let's get a bunch of students. So we got a bunch of friends together, about the size of this room, 120 individuals, and we went up to Sacramento. And I know many of you guys have led or been part of all sorts of rallies in Sacramento and meeting with legislators, and it's incredibly important because when we went up there, it's one of the first times a lot of these officials had heard directly from students about what was going on in our communities. So on Cal Lobby Day, which was March 11th, 2002, almost 10 years ago, or I guess a little bit more than 9 years ago, we organized this group and we got in a bunch of buses and we went up to Sacramento. And I met with my hometown legislature for the first time, and it was actually my first meeting where I actually was leading the meeting. And so I go and I sit down, and I'd done a little bit of research, and I had found out that this individual not only went to Berkeley, but also lived in the same dorm that I lived in my freshman year. And so I go and I sit down, and I'm like, so, Assembly member, thank you so much for taking the time to meet with us. We're all here from the University of California, and we want to talk to you about why we need affordable and accessible education as well as housing. And he said, he goes, great, how are things on Cal's campus? I was like, oh, they're great. I saw that you're a Cal Bear as well. How did you like your time? And he goes, oh, I loved it. And we talked about football games and Blondie's Pizza and Telegraph Avenue and all the important things about the area. And then I was like, and I heard that you were a Bowlsman. And a Bowls Hall is that big castle on the hill for those that go to any of the football games. It's a big castle that's right next to Memorial Stadium. It's an all-guys dorm, and it's a dorm that's been there since the early 1900s. And he goes, I was a Bowlsman. He goes, you are as well? I was like, yes, I am. And he goes, well, how is it? I'm like, well, tell me a little bit about your experience. He goes, oh, I loved it. I had my room, and then Jimmy had the room across the hall, and we had that lounge between us where we would entertain guests on weekend, and we'd have a bunch of friends over. He goes, oh, it was absolutely amazing. How is it now? And I said, it's almost exactly the same. And I start telling him about all of the fun traditions, about the Cal band stopping there after every football game and singing songs and going up to the tower and watching concerts in the Greek theater and all these fun things that were shared experiences. And I go, but I guess there's just been one difference. And that's, that room that you were in and the room that Jimmy was in? Yeah, they've now jammed 2 students into each of those rooms. And that lounge where you would have friends come over and entertain guests on weekends, they've now jammed 4 students into there. So things are almost exactly the same, except for where there were 2 students, there's now 8. And all of a sudden he got really quiet and started looking around the room. And of course I was supposed to be leading this, so I had no idea what I was supposed to say when an elected official stops talking, because that rarely happens. And I start looking around, and all of a sudden he just starts shaking his head and he goes, 8 students. Because we used to complain that we didn't have enough space for all of our stuff. That's just ridiculous. What can we do about it? Well, luckily we had also done our research and we found out that there was opportunities for affordable housing to be put into a state housing bond. It would have been the first time, and ultimately was the first time, the state of California funded student housing, as it wasn't viewed as we ultimately changed it so it wasn't viewed as an auxiliary resource, but was actually something that was essential to student life. We also said we need to freeze student tuition. We need to put a moratorium on student fee raises in the state. And he turns to me and he goes, yeah, that's something I can support. And I'll bet you I've got some friends up here that can do the same. We ended up meeting with 110 out of 120 legislators that day. And it was one of the most effective state lobby days as it froze student tuition for about 5 years, and it got $30 million for student housing. So it was a group of just a handful of people who came together and over 6 months ended up getting a $130 million legislative victory. And she just stops me and she goes, "Don't give me that political answer. When you go and you meet with, when you go and you meet with a member, you can give that response. But I want you to think about it right now. How does this feel? Because if it wasn't for the three of you, talking about myself, my couch surfing friend, and the third guy, none of this would have ever happened." So I took the remainder of that day sort of walking around the Capitol grounds and really started to think about that. And of course, one of the quotes that comes back to me is one that I'm sure many of you have heard and are probably even in some of the packets in front of you, which is a Margaret Mead quote of, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has." Now, was three people ultimately, getting $130 million from our state legislature changing the world? Probably not. But it changed the lives of about 1 million students or so who didn't have to pay additional fees. It changed the lives of people who were able to go to college who wouldn't be able to go otherwise. It changed the lives. Now I walk around the Berkeley campus and there's 6 new buildings that exist that didn't exist there before. 600 new beds, places where people can sleep and be within walking distance so that they could engage in student life and be fully engaged citizens. And that was just my story. And what we realized was we wanted to take this taste of empowerment, we wanted to spread it across the country. So for the past 9 years, that's really been our main goal. And the goal was not to say, here is the agenda, and we're going to go out and pursue this agenda and get all of these millennials behind us. We were like, no. What was so powerful was that 3 people stood up and said that they had a problem, they had a solution, and they wanted some support from elected officials to help implement that solution. That's what we can do all across the country, and that's what's been going on over the course of these past 9 years, is we've mobilized tens of thousands of millennials all across the country, invested in hundreds of projects, and I hear we're going to invest in a handful more here today. And as I've been hearing these conversations, it feels like we're getting, I've been so incredibly impressed with the direction that we've gone as an organization, because we're moving more and more from luxury organizing to meeting critical needs in communities and getting people together who know exactly what those needs are, know exactly what those solutions are, and they may need just a little bit of money to get it rolling, or they may need a few connections, or they may just need to come together to talk it out. And that's really what Democracy 2.0 has helped do. And I am incredibly proud of the direction this organization has gone. And now I'm now able to introduce the person who I helped turn the reins over to just a few years ago. I ran the organization for 6 years, and then at that point, I actually gave a speech about Democracy 2.0 and talked about our Democracy 2.0 declaration. And somehow it resonated with the National Conference on Citizenship, where I was giving the speech and introducing it for the first time. And they then offered me a job to come run a congressionally chartered organization out of D.C. And so that took me out to D.C., and I had to look around and say, well, what are we going to do with Mobilize? Well, luckily we had built a phenomenal team, and a team that you guys has continued to build, and you guys have got to know. And she walked away, so I don't know if I'm still introducing her or not. So I now wanted to, as we go into this, as we go into this process, it's one that is really about hearing people's stories, understanding how people can make change, and ultimately investing in that change. And the person who's really leading this the person who's really leading this moving forward is the CEO of Mobilize, who has done phenomenal things in taking the organization from a struggling group of 2 or 3 staff to a thriving group of 10 staff and $1 million budget, and foundations knocking down the door saying, how can we invest in this generation? How can we make it happen? So I'd like to introduce Maya Nista, the CEO of Mobilize.